And now for the second half of this episode with Steve Murphy, the other half of the DEA agents made famous by Netflix Narcos. How are you doing today, Steve?
I'm doing well, Eric. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
I'm really thrilled to have you, and I understand you actually spent a little bit of time in my neck of the woods.
I did. I started as a police officer, uniformed officer in Bluefield, West Virginia in 1975. But in 1981, I was picked up as a special agent with the Norfolk and Western Railroad Company, which is now Norfolk Southern Railroad. And I moved to lived in Virginia Beach, but I actually worked 2 years on Lambert's Point, the coal piers down there in Norfolk. So love that area.
That is really cool. And how is it different, though? Because I've never really investigated what exactly a railroad police officer did or does.
Yeah, they have the responsibility of investigating any crimes committed against the railroad. The railroad has years ago had a lot of, I guess, power. Even our retirement system was a federal railroad retirement system. But anyway, railroad policeman investigates all crimes committed against the railroad except capital crimes, and then you call in the local investigators on that. And like when I spent 2 years in Norfolk, then I transferred back to West Virginia, and I still maintain jurisdiction in West Virginia and Virginia. So it's more than a security guard because there are investigative functions, but to be quite honest, it just wasn't really what I wanted to do in law enforcement. So not taking anything away from the railroad cops that are out there now. I got some great friends, and there's some outstanding investigators that I learned a lot from, but just wasn't what I wanted to do.
Okay, and I think you had applied for different federal positions. Did you happen to apply for the FBI or Treasury or any of the other agencies?
Yeah, I applied to be an FBI agent, and I'd like to jokingly say the best thing that ever happened to me is they didn't take me. But that's kind of law enforcement humor, and the contractor understand what I'm talking about. And actually applied to be a customs agent through the Department of Treasury.
Mm.
And the first notice I got from them was to come in and take the test to be an IRS agent. Well, I didn't want to be an IRS agent. I'm not that smart, to be honest with you. But went and took the test, and the IRS never called me, so I must have really screwed up that test.
I've had actually 9 FBI agents on, and I'm always curious about where these jurisdictions are and where they overlap, because to me there has to be a lot of overlap between DEA and FBI. You both handle drug cases, right?
Yeah, and here's the big difference. So DEA is a single mission agency. That's their only responsibility is investigating narcotics and narcotics traffickers. Okay. We have no other crimes that we investigate, maybe money laundering that's associated with that. And then there are some peripheral crimes such as human trafficking that are involved in that type of business, and extortion, but it's all related to the drug business. So it's one crime that DEA is responsible for investigating. If you look at the Bureau, they have over 400 different crime categories they're responsible for investigating. I mean, talk about being overwhelmed. And, we like to give them a hard time, and it's just friendly competition between agencies. They've even got one crime that says, or one law that says, if there's a crime committed that doesn't fall in one of the other categories, they're still responsible for it. So, God bless those guys. They've got their hands full with everything that they're responsible for trying to keep up with.
So if a homicide is involved with a drug case, then would the FBI come in and work with you on it, or how does that break down?
No, a homicide we would call the local investigator. So, like I was stationed in North Carolina at one point. Depending on what jurisdiction you're in, if you're in a bigger city where they have experienced homicide investigators, you'd probably call them in. But if you're out maybe in a more rural area, you might call the state. Like in North Carolina, you might call the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. In South Carolina, it's the State Law Enforcement Division. I know in Florida, it's just forgot Florida Law Enforcement Division. So it really depends on where you're at when the crime happens as to whether you call them in. We do not have the authority to investigate a crime, nor a murder, nor do most of our people have that experience. That's something you don't want to mess up the crime scene.
I believe in the book you talked about a particular incident where you didn't know if it was bad guys who were casing you when you were casing a place. or were observing it, and it wound up being cops. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we call that blue on blue situation. So, what happened? I was still a relatively new agent. I no longer had a senior partner that I answered to, but you know what? If you've got a brain, you always maintain those connections because the guy I worked with at that time was Gene Frankar, and he's probably one of the smartest human beings I ever met in my life. And still, as you know, as newer guys coming up making cases, even though you've got all these years of law enforcement experience, you know, you're still going back and seeking advice because he really knew what he was doing. So we had an informant that gave us the information. At this time, another agent, Kevin Stevens, and I had become partners, and he was a little bit younger than I was as far as time on the job. Mm-hmm. But we were smart enough to run everything by Gene. So Gene, he said, yeah, go with it, but you know, these are the things you need to be careful of. Well, we went out and set up our pre-surveillance of the meeting spot, and it was actually a Denny's restaurant over the Miami International Airport. So all of our cars have blacked out windows, and I pull into this parking lot across from the Denny's where I could see the front door. And, you know, cops are notorious for backing in, even in unmarked cars, backing into a parking place. So you always pull into a parking place because that, you know, it's less obvious. And the criminals recognize that as well. So anyway, I'm watching the front door, and after about 20 minutes, I'd parked next to a pickup truck, and it had blacked out windows, but everybody's got blacked out windows in Florida, mm-hmm. South Florida. So anyway, after about 20, 30 minutes, the truck, I hear the motor start, and I look. I didn't realize anybody was sitting in it because I hadn't seen any movement. And he pulls out, and then he pulls on the other side of me and now blocks my view. And I'm thinking, well, my first thoughts are, well, crap, now I can't see the front door. So it only took a few seconds to realize something's not right here. So I alerted all the other DEA agents on the radio, and I pulled out of the lot, and we went to a different meeting site. And we all, you know, we knew that was either bad guys. It was either the bad guys setting us up or doing surveillance on us, or it might be other cops. So we all put our bulletproof vests on and so forth, put our gun rigs on, and we came back. And as we pulled in the parking lot, we had guys come from behind, and we had 3 cars coming from the front. We turned our blue lights on so they knew we were cops and got out. And sure enough, it was undercover narcotics detectives from Hunley, a police department. So our informant was talking to one of their informants. And you know what? I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the dangers associated when you're working undercover. Law enforcement agencies and personnel can be extremely competitive. You know, they say we're all type A personalities. I don't think I am, but my wife says that's what makes me a type A personality. So you're very protective of your investigations, which is extremely dangerous. And in this case, you know, thank the good Lord it worked out for us. But I mean, that could have ended up in a gun battle right there, and we didn't really got the case started.
Is that relatively common? I wanted to ask that because that to me is such a frightening scenario where you have a mix-up and potentially it'll be all good guys killing each other.
It happens more than you want to admit to it. I know there was a case where years prior to this down in South Florida where a Hialeah police officer shot another undercover because they didn't know that each were in the same situation. But now deconfliction centers have been set up across the country, especially in major cities, so that agencies, if you're going to go out and do a deal, you contact the deconfliction center. And I don't want to give up too much information about how they work, but the mechanisms are in place now so that you can prevent blue on blue situations.
Okay, so there's a bit more communication and cooperation between agencies, I'm praying.
Absolutely, thank God.
Now, you were in Miami which years again? Early 80s?
I got there in 1987 and I left in 1991.
Okay, that's right, because you got to Colombia after Javier, right?
Correct.
Okay, so were you during the thick of the, quote, cocaine cowboys period?
It was still very active down there in 1987. I think it was starting to slowly calm down a little bit, but it was still very common to find, murder bodies anywhere, trunks of cars or houses or wherever. You just never knew. It was still extremely violent down there during the time. Everybody carried guns. Cell phones were just starting to come out then, believe it or not, in the late 1980s. And
Mm.
quite honestly, you don't profile, but one of the first indicators, if you saw if you saw people that you thought might be Colombian or Cuban carrying cell phones, because they were so new, it was relatively a good option that could be someone involved in the narcotics business. Now,
Either that or real estate agent.
exactly, but and the people that listen to this, please don't come back and badmouth me for profiling, because you had to do what you had to do to stay alive, and one of the things that keeps you alive is your observation skills.
I actually lived in Fort Lauderdale in like 88 time period.
Mm-hmm.
And that was right when Cops came out. I don't know if you remember the show Cops.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that first season of Cops I thought was very interesting because every episode seemed to take place within 1 mile of the apartment I was living in.
What kind of place were you living in, Eric?
It's kind of a dump. I was 18 years old. I was going to be a travel agent type of person, wound up working at Alamo Rent-A-Car. But anyway, that's a side note. It wasn't only Miami that was problematic, right? Fort Lauderdale had issues too, if I recall.
Oh, all the way up to West Palm, actually up to St. Lucie. Port St. Lucie was at one point was very active with smugglers coming into the different bays and the different docks that were associated there. And then you had it all the way down to the Keys. And then even on the west side, Fort Myers, over in that area, South Florida was just eat up with it. There were, we had an informant that would fly loads for us out of Colombia and would land on a deserted road out in the middle of the Everglades. There's a lot of places you could hide out there if you're coming in by boat, especially around the Keys, and get into those mangroves. Boy, you can hide all day long in there and nobody ever finds you. It was it's almost like the song says, a smuggler's paradise.
That's interesting. You brought up the informant who was flying for you. I mean, was he literally practically working for you? I mean, did you have an arrangement to where he wasn't going to go to prison because he kept flying? I mean, how does that work?
It does. Excuse me. We run everything through the U.S. Attorney's Office. So we have various assistant U.S. attorneys that we work with. And it's just like any other business. There's guys that you get along very well with that are aggressive and, that you become friends with. And so you call them and say, okay, this is what we'd like to do. And we want to use this particular individual as an informant. Here's his background. Here's his qualifications. Here's what we think he can do. Mm-hmm. Now, everything that you do with an informant has to be documented. So, and you know what? There's even times when we follow our informants to make sure they're not lying to us. Because once they lie to you, now you've got an integrity issue and you can't put them on the witness stand. You have to disclose to the defense attorney that they have been caught in not telling the truth all the time. Does an informant tell you the truth all the time? Absolutely not. You never trust them. I mean, it's amazing. They are taking a lot of risk and a lot of danger, and they're being paid very well for the risk that they take. But they're snitching on people. And if they're snitching on you today, if they can snitch on me tomorrow to get out of trouble, they will.
Well, is it kind of a free pass? I mean, I want to ask because it's like, obviously they're being paid by whomever their bosses are. And I don't know. It seems problematic. Do you ever get caught into entrapment issues or questions of that kind?
No. Now, a good defense attorney will always accuse you of that, but we don't do that. Our informant. So in this particular case, our informant offered a form of transportation for anything you want to transport it anywhere in the world. Mm. Now he was contacted. The word got out, and he was contacted by this narcotics group who wanted to, move cocaine from the Guajira Peninsula of Colombia into South Florida. And he was just offering a service. Now, if your informant doesn't tell you beforehand that he's going to do something and you authorize it as his handling agent, then it's illegal. He cannot do that. And a lot of informants try that because they want to make government money from the government, but they also want to run deals on the side. And every time they get caught, the first thing they say is, oh, I'm working for so-and-so. I'm working for this agency. And so the arresting officers call us. And if I don't know anything about it, it's like, put him in jail. I had no knowledge of this whatsoever. So, and they are told that at the very beginning. They just think they're smarter than us, and they might be, but we usually catch up with them.
Well, time, I'm sure, factors into that. You can only get lucky so many times.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, from Miami, obviously, you went into Colombia, and I know you were on our mutual friend Chris Lockhead's show,
Mm-hmm.
and you didn't exactly fit in or resemble everybody around you. How was that?
I'm not sure what you're trying to say there, Eric. No, I mean, you can see me. I just got back from Florida last night, so I actually do have a little bit of color. But my background is English and Irish. My mother's mother immigrated from Essex, England, to the United States when she was a little girl. My father's family is all from, we believe, we're from Cork, Ireland. So I'm about as white skinned as you get, right? You go to Hispanic country, I don't blend in. I'm 6'2". I have light colored eyes. I used to have, before my hair fell out and what's left turned white, I have light colored hair. I mean, you can hear my country accent. So when I speak Spanish, I speak country Spanish. So, and it was when my wife and I first got to Bogota, we'd go shopping, and there's a mall in the northern part of Bogota called Unicentro. We would walk through there and people would just stop and stare at us. And my wife has some Indian blood in her, some American Indian blood in her. So her skin's just a little bit darker than mine. But I mean, they're looking at me and you're very self-conscious about it because you're thinking the only Colombians I'd ever met were the ones I'd put in jail. So I went to Colombia thinking everybody down here is a drug trafficker, which is really stupid, naive on my part, but that's another story. And so you're wondering, was my zipper open? Do I have some food in my teeth, something on my nose? Or, I mean, everything goes through your mind. But it continually happens, and it's just that you're kind of an anomaly. Some of these people had never seen an American before, and they might not have known I was American. They just knew that I was non-Colombian. So eventually, you kind of get used to it. I mean, you still keep your eyes open, but you learn to live with that.
Okay, and you had mentioned country Spanish, and in the book you talked about how you refused to learn Spanish for a long time, and I can relate to that personally because I grew up in Tucson, Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And I was not going to take Spanish, damn it, because I was in Spanish all the time. So I did something really brilliant. I took French.
Yeah, me too.
which is like really nutty. And then I wound up in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, taking care of Cuban migrants in the later 90s under Clinton. And my biggest regret of all time is that I never took Spanish when I was younger because everyone who had high school Spanish wound up being almost halfway fluent by the time they were done.
Right.
So you ultimately did take Spanish then, I'm guessing.
Well, right. When I was selected to go, and I volunteered to go to Colombia. I'm not sure if Javier mentioned it, but in DEA, they won't send you overseas. You have to volunteer to go. Mm. So I knew I'd get to go to language school. And to back up just a little bit, I mean, I was extremely naive. I grew up in Middle Tennessee and Southern West Virginia, and I like to joke around and I'm a cross between a redneck and a hillbilly, and I'm okay with that. I know what I am. And when I first got to Miami, I mean, I wanted to be there because you mentioned cops. Well, I had been watching Miami Vice, and I thought, boy, that's what I want to do because that's exciting, and you're going to have the fancy cars and the flashy boats and all the bikini-clad women, and none of that ever came about. I'm still waiting.
Denny's.
I got what?
You got Denny's.
That's exactly right. Well, I made it to the top tier, didn't I? But, when I got down there, the other agents in the group, the senior agents, we'd all go out and have lunch together, and they'd take you to a restaurant where the menus were in Spanish, the waitress couldn't speak any English, and in my naivety, I'm looking at the other agents going, what the hell? Did we cross a bridge and go into Cuba? I mean, why isn't anybody speaking English here? I'm an American, I was being really stupid. I mean, just being as redneck as I could be. Mm-hmm. And eventually my wife and I, we learned through living down there that a lot of those people, the circumstances that they came into South Florida is they were trying to escape a communist regime out of Cuba. They're trying to find a better life for themselves in the United States. This is where the world wants to come to. That's why we have immigration problems now, because everybody wants to come here, right? And through, I guess, a little bit of maturity and living in a different environment instead of this little country boy, I'm in a big city now. You develop a better understanding and some compassion for your fellow man. And I pray the good Lord and ask for forgiveness for being an idiot. I still have to do that on a regular basis, but. When I went to language school, After we went to language school, now we're stationed in Colombia. When my wife and I would fly home, we'd fly up for Christmas or whatever to visit our parents, and we'd have to fly into Roanoke, Virginia.
Mhm.
Well, a lot of times my wife would stay longer than I would, and I'd come back, and there would be Hispanics at the Roanoke airport, and they didn't speak English, and they're trying to talk to the lady at the counter, and of course they didn't speak Spanish, and I was able to step up and say, "Hey, let me help you translate here a little bit." And I tell you what, that gave me such a this sounds kind of stupid or whatever to say, but it actually made you feel proud of the fact that you could help your fellow man. If it's something as simple as she wants to know, do you want to check your bag? Do you want to change your seat? This is your gate number. Just simple everyday things, but it made me feel good at that point that I could step up and help somebody with that. And even today, and Spanish is much more prevalent in the United States now than it was back then. But
Mhm.
even today, when we get the opportunity, especially having our travel all around the world, and you'll see a lot of Spanish speakers that are having a hard time getting along in whatever country, and either Javier and I will step up and we'll translate for them. And it's still a good feeling. So going to DEA and living in Miami for 4 years, it was a real eye opener, but it was also a great growing experience for my wife and I both.
Oh, I'm sure. When I was taking care of the migrants, that taught me a lot because literally they watch their relatives die, get eaten by sharks, and
Oh,
everything else coming over. And meeting some of them, it was quite literally, oh my God, the only difference between you and me is where I was born.
exactly. Exactly. It could have been us rather than them.
And that is very eye opening because I mean it's like, well, that's just a circumstance. You can't blame anybody for their birth.
Right. That's exactly right.
No, pick better parents. No, I'm just kidding. All right. So now you volunteered to go to Colombia itself or just volunteered for an overseas assignment?
Well, I actually volunteered to go to Barranquilla, which is up on the coast. I did that as some of the agents there. I had been working a joint case with them. We'd seized a couple $1 million based on information they were sending us, and it just really seemed exciting. And my wife came to me. We'd been in Miami over 3 years, and she said, she's a registered nurse, and she likes working in the exciting parts of the hospital, the trauma units, and
Oh,
the
wow.
the things that I think are just really grotesque. She really likes that kind of stuff. And she said, our life's been really exciting here. What's the next most exciting thing we can do? I said, well, we could go to Colombia. We could transfer. And she me like, I had three heads and like I'm an idiot. And she thought about it for a while. And she came back. She said, you know what? You still want to go down there? And I said, yeah. And she said, if we're going to do it, let's do it while we're young. So I applied for Barranquilla and was accepted. Had the paperwork and everything. Actually, in the DEA culture, when you get transferred to a nice office, like an overseas office, you pay for the party. So I'd already taken my group out, when we'd had a good evening, and then I found out that they took the transfer away from me because they needed somebody that spoke Spanish there quickly.
Ah,
So a guy in headquarters, he called me, and I just cannot remember his name. Honestly, can't remember his name. I wish I could, so I could say thank you. But he called me and he says, "Hey, you just got screwed, right?" And I said, "Well, I figured that." And he said, "Well, we've got 3 openings coming in Bogota. Would you be interested in going there?" And I said, "Yes." And so when the openings came out, I applied for them, and that's how we ended up in Bogota. But it's you have to volunteer to go do that.
okay. I don't know if you've probably been asked every question, but when you were there, obviously Pablo Escobar is the big, celebrity criminal. I don't know how to even describe him because he's famous for being a monster,
Mhm.
not necessarily a great thing. Did either of you ever meet him?
No, you know what? The only time I ever saw Pablo Escobar was the day he died, and that was after he was dead. We did surveillance on his wife. We'd done surveillance. We'd seen his children, and they were juveniles, so we really weren't doing surveillance on the kids, but we were on Pablo's wife Tata,
Hmm.
and the kids were usually with her. But no, never saw Pablo. I mean, if we'd have seen him, there would have been an encounter.
Okay, well, I didn't know if you might have seen him during the time when he was quote unquote in jail.
No, that was part of his deal. We as the good guys, the gringos, the Colombian police, Colombian military, could not come within 2 miles of the perimeter of that prison.
Oh, okay, I did not realize that. So he had a really nice deal then.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I'll just tell you, he negotiated this deal where it's called the self-surrender program that the Attorney General of Colombia started and the president went along with. And so he was allowed to plead guilty to one felony that he got to pick. And in return, he was absolved of every other crime he committed in his life, including murders, including thousands and thousands of murders. So when the Attorney General says, "Oh, this is great, we accept your plea," and there's like, "Wait a minute, I've got conditions." He said, "One is I'm going to build my prison. You're not going to put me in a Colombian prison because I got to have a place of safety." And they said, "Okay." He said, "Well, second of all, I'm going to handpick my fellow prisoners because again, there's so many people out here who want to kill me." So I don't know if you knew this. There's only 14 prisoners in that prison, counting Pablo, and he handpicked all of them. One of them was his brother. Then the third condition was all the guards that are here, I'm going to handpick them, and I'm going to pay them because I don't want the government of Colombia or the citizens of Colombia to have to suffer through the burden of paying for that.
Oh my God!
And the government said, "Okay." And then he only got a 5-year prison sentence. And on top of everything else, they didn't even take any of his assets. So all he had to do was 5 years in this country club prison that he built himself and he paid for, and he would have been a free man. But man, his ego, his pride, he just couldn't control it. And, we know what happened to him.
Which is almost good, except for so many people got injured. Speaking of him paying for things, I did have a question. I think this was covered in the show a little bit too. Was there a point that the dollar, as in US dollar in Colombia, would be problematic because it wouldn't have the value since there was so much of it?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, Pablo loved having bulk cash. He liked having those US dollars. I think he probably felt like he was snubbing his nose at the United States. And he, what he was. He was the world's first narco-terrorist. He's a man who developed a business model of drug trafficking that eventually made him responsible for 80% of the cocaine in the world. Holy cow. That's Chris Lockhead. We talked about
category creation.
Exactly. And that's exactly what he preaches. And Pablo was doing it, years before Chris came along. But he had a problem in that, the banks, they wouldn't take that much cash in there. I mean, he could pay banks off and they could take a certain amount, but he was bringing in so much, they couldn't do it. So he had to figure out what to do with that money. He was burying it. He was trying different investments. He built over 800 multi-million-dollar homes throughout Colombia. He had a fleet of aircraft that was 3 or 4 times what we had in DEA, and that would have considered our entire worldwide fleet. He had 3 to 4 times that many aircraft just in Colombia for himself.
Wow.
His son even talks about that if he wanted to go somewhere, he had a couple of helicopters he could call on to come over and pick him up, take him wherever he wanted to go. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, that seems completely obscene and crazy. And I would think if you have so much cash, it's problematic to spend it. And I've had FBI agent on, I believe it's Eugene Casey, and he talked about one of the laundering mechanisms because he worked money laundering. And I'm guessing you guys had to look into that too, because that might be another way to find these people. But he said that what would happen is like a business in Colombia, let's say a hardware store, would order all their parts from the US as an example. And they would go to the hardware store and say, okay, we're going to pay your debt. You give us the money here in pesos or, whatever. And then they would pay the currency through a wire to the United States. And that was one of the methods to launder. Did you run into any of that?
Well, the big thing for us was, believe it or not, primarily bulk cash being transported back into Colombia was the biggest means. But now they had the black market peso exchange, which is very similar to what you're talking about. They would buy products throughout other parts, legitimately buy products throughout the world, and then bring those into Colombia and sell them. And now you've got your cash back. So that's part of the black market peso exchange. They developed a thing that has gotten very popular through other countries called trade-based money laundering schemes, where they buy goods in other places like truckloads of clothing and ship those down. There are some extremely sophisticated money laundering schemes that I have no idea how they operate, how they work. If you ever saw the movie The Infiltrator, the agent that's portrayed in that, the DEA guy, who's actually an IRS and a customs agent and then DEA, He ended up bringing down one of the largest banking systems in the world based out of Saudi Arabia.
Mm.
I've read his book, I've seen his movie, and he's a friend, and I've had him try to explain things to me, and I still can't tell you how that money laundering scheme works that he was working on. He's on the intelligence level, he's way up here, but he did a hell of a job. But that's the thing in working these organizations. Why are they in business? They're in business to make money and to have personal power. Well, if you take their stuff from them, their assets, whether it's houses or cash or airplanes or whatever it is, you really hurt them when you take their things from them. And the laws are set up in the United States so that you can do that as well as other countries, and you share the assets with the other countries.
Isn't there a problem with some of that, though? I know that there's actually controversy now about, I believe there was a police department. I don't remember the state, so I'm not going to throw it out there. I think in a southern state where the sheriff's department was busted because they were using these seizure laws to essentially get a bunch of booty themselves.
Yeah, and that still happens. It's not prevalent throughout the United States, but they're trying, especially counties that are along the primary transportation corridors.
Mm-hmm.
Here on the East Coast, I'm outside the Washington, D.C. area. You got I-95 running up and down the East Coast. So some sheriff's departments, some of the smaller agencies will put units out on the interstates. I drove home from Florida yesterday, and one county that I'm very familiar with in one of the southern states had 5 units sitting out there watching cars go by. Now, you can't call it profiling because that's been determined to be improper.
Sure.
But the truth is that's what they're doing. They're looking for indicators that would suggest that a car either traveling south is carrying money or a car traveling north is carrying drugs. They're more focused on the cars going south that would be carrying the money.
Mm.
And then, this particular county I'm talking about I know it very well. I've worked in that county before, and it's one of the poorer counties in that state. And, this is how they fund some of the other things in their law enforcement agency is through the asset sharing that goes along with that. Is it right? I'll be honest with you. I don't have a problem with it in the fact that they're taking drug traffickers' money. Mm-hmm. But you've got to follow the rules, and we're a country of laws, and you got to follow the law.
Okay, and that leads into, and I guess it's my last question, which is probably an aggravating question. I'm not sure, but the DEA is going to turn 50 soon, and I'd say the quote war on drugs is almost 50 years old. Are we winning?
You know what? I'm not offended by that question at all. And I'm going to tell you the truth. And this is, Steve Murphy's opinion. Javier and I travel all around the world. We're into our 5th year now of what our speaking bureau agents call our world tour. This is the last thing either one of us expected to be doing in retirement. But, thank the good Lord it's worked out because I'm loving it. But at the end of every show that we do, we have a question and answer session. And the audience can ask us anything. It can be about the investigation. It can be about the show Narcos on Netflix. We even talk about our personal lives to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. So it's a very common question about the war on drugs. And here's my opinion. When you're going to fight a war, you get your allies together, you get your personnel lined up, you get all your materials, your rockets, your missiles, your planes, your tanks, everything. And you don't go in to lose, do you? You go in to win. Well, here we're fighting the war on drugs. We're going after the world's first narco-terrorist. I don't even know what a narco-terrorist was. We're going after a man who's responsible for 80% of the world's cocaine, a man who's responsible for tens of thousands of murders. One of his own sicarios, one of his own assassins who just died about a month or two ago. Popeye. Right. Says the number is over 50,000 murders that Pablo Escobar is responsible for. So here, if we're doing a war on drugs, we're going after the number one guy in the cocaine business, Pablo Escobar. What'd they send? 2 guys. Sent me and Javier down there. That's not a war. It's in my opinion, the war on drugs is one of the biggest misnomers there's ever been from the United States government. Now, and please don't cut this out when you edit, but I'm certainly not taking anything away from all the men and women out there who are sacrificing their lives, putting themselves in harm's way on a daily basis.
Mhm.
I want to recognize the diversion investigators, the intelligence analysts, the support staff, everybody that's involved in that, because they are doing their best to serve the public. That's what a police officer is a public servant. So all these people are out there trying to serve the public. But when you send two people down there after Pablo Escobar, does that sound like a war? Sounds more like a joke, doesn't it?
It really does. And that does lead into briefly the legalization question. Whether is it worth it? Is there more people who die because it's illegal and highly profitable than, let's say, if it was not? I'm not sure. Where do you stand?
You can probably guess where I stand on legalization, right? It's down. And if Javier was on here, he would jump on first to talk because he knows that this is a hot button issue for me. And
Sure.
And so I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. We're not in favor of legalization. I've heard the same arguments. Hey, it'll get us out of some of the states out of the tax problems. Well, that hasn't happened. Well, it'll put an end to the violence associated with marijuana trafficking. That hasn't happened. We've still got Mexican gangs working here in the United States growing, I call it skunk weed, but illegally growing marijuana out in the forest and the hills and wherever they are. And they still have booby traps set up, and they still have armed people out there, and there's still gun battles, and there's still murders. The legal marijuana shops, they know that's a cash cow for them, so they go rob them. That's not stopping the violence, much less, I read a report here long ago, a news article that I think it was in Colorado that 42 or 47% of all traffic accidents involved impaired driving from smoking weed. So there's another problem that nobody thought about. We look at countries around the world where they've tried legalization. It hasn't been successful in a single country yet. I mean, yeah, we think we're the greatest here in the United States. We think we can do it better than everybody else, but not this. It's just people say, well, you got alcohol is legal. That is. I don't drink. I don't drink alcohol anymore. I quit drinking years ago, over 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. But that's not, in my book, that's not an argument. It's just another way for people to kill themselves. So that kind of translates down into our young people as well. It's been proven, if you do your studies, it's been proven that the human brain doesn't fully mature until you're in mid-20s.
True.
And it's also been proven that smoking weed inhibits the growth of the young people's brains. Mm-hmm. So even if they wait till 18 to start smoking weed, when it's legal in these legal shops, their brains aren't finished developing. So now if let's say the smoking the weed on a regular basis causes their brain to not fully develop, well, now who's going to be responsible for taking care of these people because they can't reach their full potential? Or who's going to be responsible for taking the people that have respiratory problems, because when you smoke weed, you inhale it in your lungs just like cigarette, right? Mm-hmm. Now, it may not have the same carcinogens that cigarettes do, but here's the bottom line. Just like you, just like every other working person in this country, I've worked my butt off for years. I've taken risks that most people don't take. I did it because I loved doing it. I felt like I was helping my fellow man. But here I am in my retirement years, or coming into my retirement years. Why should you or I, the hardworking, tax-paying, honest citizens, be responsible for taking care of people who made bad decisions, who now have health problems from smoking weed or using whatever drug the drug of choice? Why should we have to do that? Why should we have to bear that burden, financial as well as moral obligation? We're going to do it because we're the United States. We do take care of each other, but it's just not fair when I was a cop for 38 years. I can't tell you how many times I've been shot at. And thank the good Lord I survived. Yeah. But I think everybody has a responsibility to take care of themselves, make sound decisions. I try to teach my children, for every decision you make, there's a consequence. Could be good or it could be bad. In my opinion, legalization results in bad consequences.
Well, perfect. And I actually had asked Javier that as well. So I did get to explore both sides, or not both sides, but just both your opinions. They're right. Not necessarily opposite sides. And Steve, this has been just outstanding. Thank you so much for coming on. Now, people can find you at deanarcos.com, right?
Absolutely. And I really appreciate the opportunity. I love this interview because it's a little bit off what people usually ask us, and most people want to hear my opinion on legalization. Never ask me that question again.
I have to ask. It's crazy not to.
Yeah, and it's I know Eric, and I'm putting a little self commercial out here. We
Please.
have our book out, Manhunters, which I'm pretty sure you're probably going to mention, but I want to mention it as well. And
Yes.
and we're all kind of stuck at home now with the coronavirus, self isolating and self quarantine, whatever you want to call it. And my wife and I are doing the same thing. So we're trying to think of ways that we could maybe help people. And my wife and I are actually exploring a couple things to help the local law enforcement here and the hospital because she's a nurse. But anyway, for the month of April, we're offering a 15% discount on our book. Go on our website, you can order it. It's $29.95. It will be autographed with our actual signatures, and you can even put a little personal message on there that we're happy to write to you. The price includes shipping and handling. We market this book as a sure cure for insomnia. So if you're having trouble sleeping at night, this is the cure.
Oh, come on. It's a good book. I have the audiobook, so you can't sign that, but I still am enjoying that. And I did want to reach out. If you are looking for things to do, I would love to have you both, if you're interested. I do a live stream. And with a live stream, it allows people in my audience and your audience to be able to ask questions of you directly in the chat. And if you guys are interested in doing that, I'd love to have you come on in the next couple of weeks. And we could put it out. People could ask questions and give a great opportunity for them to ask things directly, because I do a lot of research, but I don't always get to the great questions.
No, that would be exciting. We haven't done that yet. And we're all stuck at home for now. You know what? I need something else to do because my wife's going to get ready to work me to death around the house.
All right. Well, we'll set that up. And Steve, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Eric.